Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. You know, there's a lot of different subgenres in gaming, and while many games can pretty much be lumped under one banner, it often makes sense to categorise some games as their own kind of thing. Case in point, futuristic racing games, where developers have a stab at predicting what kind of high-octane thrills we'll be seeing in the years to come. So, yep, that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. Some games where you race in the future. Now, how about I shut the hell up, you press that subscribe button, and we start our engines. Let's start with what is probably one of the most well-known futuristic racing games, F-Zero, for the Super Nintendo from Nintendo. This was a very early game for the system, and one that I got fairly soon after getting my SNES back in the 90s, and I like it now just as much as I did back then. You get only 4 characters to choose from, but of course each of their vehicles controls differently, and you'll really notice the difference between them. You get a few different cups, each with their own selection of tracks. They start out quite easy, but soon turn into narrow tracks littered with jumps and hazards for you to crash into. The game is really fast too, but thankfully the controls are spot on, and once you get used to how it works, you'll be speeding around the courses in no time. This was one of the first games, if not the first game, that I played that used the drift mechanic. By pressing the L or R buttons, you can do subtle turns to the left and right. These are really handy when you're going on long straights to keep yourself in the centre of the track, and you can also use the drift to take sharp corners, and you'll definitely need to master this if you want to get anywhere in the game. You also get irregular boosts. Well, actually you get 3 per race, so you'll need to learn the best place and time to use them, as you can easily send yourself flying into the rails, and if you take too much damage here or fall off the track, you will explode. If you do crash too much or fall off the track, you'll need to restart the race. You do get a few continues, and if you're new to the game, you probably are going to need them. But this game is just so much fun. It's got awesome graphics, an iconic soundtrack, and some of the best racing action on the Super Nintendo. The only real downside to the game is that it is single player only. Other than that though, this is a must own. F-Zero has had a few follow-ups, starting with F-Zero X here on the N64. The core gameplay has stayed basically the same, but everything has been ramped up to 11. This time round you have a whopping 30 characters to choose from, each with their own different craft to race in. Once again, it's loads of fun trying them all out to see which one you get to grips with the best. You've got a good selection of courses that get pretty crazy, involving loops, jumps, tunnels, and even weird pipe things that you can race on. Graphically, the game definitely isn't the best, but this was a deliberate decision as they wanted to focus on speed, and man do you get that. This game is blisteringly fast and runs at a constant 60 frames per second with no slowdown at all, even with all 30 races on screen at once. And yep, that's what you get. Every race has every single challenger taking part. If you do want to thin the crowds out a bit though, you've got a few attacks at your disposal. You can double tap the shoulder button to barge into other racers, causing them to crash and taking them out of the race. This is really fun to do. You also have a spin attack that you do by holding either R or Z and then double tapping the other one. This can be tricky to use, but you can do it in a straight line. As a reward for killing opponents, you do get a little bit of your energy back, and for every 5 kills you get an extra life. And much like the SNES version, you're probably going to need them, as this game is not easy, but man is it fun. Each of the cups is well varied, and something that's really great here and a bit of a selling point is the X Cup, which you can unlock by beating all of the other cups on all difficulties. The X Cup is a random track generator, meaning that the game technically has unlimited tracks to race on. I really can't believe this isn't a trend that caught on. Some of the tracks that you are thrown into are mental, and this is great in multiplayer. Before each race you can choose to prioritise speed or acceleration, which at the time I never really understood. But now I'm 0.3 smarter, I've realised that depending on the track layout you'll want to choose wisely. If a course is full of tight bends, you're better off with more acceleration, as you can brake and get your speed back up quickly, whereas if it's a track with more straights, you'll want a higher top speed, as you can go wild on the long straights. Here you actually get unlimited boosts, which are activated after you complete the first lap. From then on you can boost as much as you like, but be careful as your boosts use energy, so if you go too wild you'll end up blowing up your ship. This gives the game a great risk versus reward factor. I briefly mentioned earlier that there is multiplayer this time round, and you know what? That's true. Up to 4 players can go head to head on any of the unlocked tracks, and the more the merrier. This is a great party game with friends, especially on X-Cup where no one knows what the hell is around the corner. This is another must own if you have an N64. Let's go back to the Super Nintendo briefly for a look at Cyberspin, a futuristic Formula 1 style game. This is a single player game that plays in a top-down view. It doesn't give you any options when it comes to selecting vehicles or tracks, it's all very bare bones. Graphically, the game is okay, but not particularly offensive, just a little bland. It is bloody fast though, and it controls like crap, so overall is just crap, unless I'm really missing something. What's strange here is that you never really seem to turn any corners, and are always just going straight up with slight left or right bends. You do get warnings as about where the turnings are going to be, but you just sort of rotate a little bit rather than actually turning a corner, and it makes doing anything with any precision very tough. Couple this with the fact that if you do crash a couple of times, the game just unceremoniously gives you a game over. It really makes it just not fun at all to play. And to be honest, that's all I really want to say about this one. It's definitely not worth your time, so I'm not going to waste my time talking about it, but I just wanted you to know it exists. Another popular 16-bit future racing game is Rock'n'Roll Racing from Blizzard. This is the Mega Drive version, or Genesis if you live in the US. Didn't think I was going to say that, did you, Toby? This is an isometric viewed racer where you choose from a bunch of intergalactic beings who are all parodies of aliens and superheroes, which is really cool. You've got Chewie, Slimer and Batman, just to name a few, but of course they're called something else. Each of the characters has their own attributes, like having better acceleration, top speed or jumping ability. That's right, in this racer you can jump, and you'll actually need to do this on quite a few tracks that have obstacles you'll either want to avoid or holes in the track to get over. You also have a few weapons at your disposal. You've got a laser burst which you can use once per lap, and mines that you can collect and drop. On the courses you'll also find money. You'll need this to upgrade your vehicle after each race. You can buy better engines, armour, tyres and weapons. What's nice is that you really need to upgrade everything here, and you can't just rely on getting a faster engine. For example, you'll definitely need the tyres for better handling for some of the later courses. It really does make a difference. A lot of these things cost loads of money though, so you will have to do some grinding and replay a few of the same races over and over again in order to save up. And although sometimes it did kinda suck having to do this, they are all relatively quick, so it's never that much of an issue. Eventually you get to move on to a new planet which has a whole new set of tracks, and each character pretty much has their own planet to race on. It can take a while to get through all of them, but you will see them eventually. Sadly, there's no cartridge save function, so you've got to rely on passwords, which is a bit of a ball ache. One of the main draws, and actually the whole point of the name of the game, is the music, which is made up entirely of awesome rock and roll songs, and it's great. The music really fits the game, and though there's only a handful of tracks, they are varied enough and sound great, so you'll never actually get tired of listening to them. Graphically, the game is decent. The tracks aren't particularly detailed, but really they don't need to be. The surroundings, however, look good, although it would have been nice if there was some animation rather than everything just being static like it is. Overall though, this is a really fun game with decent controls and fun gameplay. The later levels get pretty tough too. Definitely check this one out. And while we're at it, let's briefly take a look at the other versions that I have. It also came out for the Super Nintendo, where the gameplay is basically exactly the same. There are a few changes to the user interface, with your health being depicted with green dots rather than a red bar and moved to a different location, but that's about it. The graphics overall are a little better here, but it's nothing major. Also, the sound quality is better, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the songs sound better, as the Mega Drive definitely has a unique sound chip to it, so which one you prefer will just be down to personal preference. Again, this version looks, sounds and still plays really well, and is well worth adding to your collection. And here is the Game Boy Advance version. This one is basically just a port of the Super Nintendo game. Strangely, the music here is really quiet, but it does sound good still. The controls are just as good as the other versions, so it still plays really well. But one thing that I'm not sure about is that the graphics are quite chunky. This seems to be where they've zoomed everything in to fit onto the small screen, and everything does seem to have been brightened up due to the lack of a backlight on the early Game Boy models. This is probably my least favourite version of the game, mainly because that it's more zoomed in, so you get to see less of the track, making cornering much tougher. Something that I do like in this version though is that they have included cartridge save, so you don't have to worry about passwords. However, it is still a good game, so if you do want some rock and roll on the go, this isn't a bad option at all. Now I've got some very exciting news. I recently bought myself a Sega Saturn, so now we're going to take a look at some futuristic games that you can play on there. Here is Cyber Speedway from Cyberdreams. This is an interesting single-player racing game where in the future there's an intergalactic racing circuit and your character has been selected to race in the intergalactic racing circuit. You've got to do trials across different planets, and if you succeed in them all you can become Earth's representative in the tournament. The game is presented through a series of cutscenes which have that classic 32-bit bad acting in them over the top of still images. At first I thought it was a bit crap, but then I kinda got into it. You've got your pit team who help you decide the best way to get out your car for each race too. You can tune your vehicle so you have more top speed, better handling or brakes. These need to be tweaked depending on the course, as some have lots of sharp tight turns whereas others have longer straights designed for top speed. I will be honest though, I just put the speed to the maximum and left everything else on normal, and I never had any issues in any of the races. Graphically, the game looks okay. It's Sega Saturn 3D, so it's never going to blow anyone away, but it does the job. The tracks all look decent, but there is a fair bit of pop-up, though I never found it made things hard to navigate. The cutscenes between levels are kind of funny though. The artwork seems to be quite low resolution, and I really couldn't tell what some of the aliens were even meant to be. To quote Duke Nukem, your face, your ass, what's the difference? The controls here are actually pretty damn good. As you have a hovercraft thingy, like we all will in the future, it is a bit floaty, but it kind of feels right and the physics are decent enough. Like with most racing games, you'll need a few races to get the feel for it, but once you do, you'll be able to take corners like a pro. There were a few times however where my craft just didn't seem to want to accelerate and I would take forever to speed up. I really have no idea why this happened, as I hadn't changed any of my settings, though it did tend to be on the ice tracks, so maybe that's exactly why it happened. Maybe I should have changed them and not ignored my pit guys. The collision detection here is quite forgiving, which is nice. You will likely hit the sides of the tracks, as well as obstacles quite often, if you're anything like me anyway. But this doesn't bring you to a dead stop like a few games do. You can take damage and crash out of races, but your power regenerates over time, so this never actually happened to me, and to be honest, you'd have to be pretty bad for it to happen. You'd also get rockets to use during races, but these are quite hard to aim, but if you do make a hit, they're really useful for overtaking those pesky opponents. I do need to mention the music here, which is basically all just butt rock, and honestly, I kinda love it. It is cheesy and it doesn't really even fit the game, but overall it was decent. This was actually a really surprising game. I honestly thought it was going to be a load of crap, but I had a lot of fun playing it, and I'll definitely be going back to complete all the races. It's really a bit of a hidden gem. Check this one out if you can. Next on the Sega Saturn is Hi-Octane, The Track Fights Back, from Bullfrog. This was also released on the PC and the PlayStation. This future racing game lets you choose from a handful of pretty random looking hovercrafts to race. You get to ride things that look like fighter jets, R-Wings from Star Fox, delivery trucks, donuts and taxis. To be honest, most of them are not very appealing at all. And then you set out on some really long races across a variety of landscapes. In the game you have a handful of weapons and boosts, you've got a minigun and rockets to attack opponents with. Each of these has upgrades you can collect as you race to make them more powerful. The minigun is kinda useless most of the time unless it's fully upgraded, but the rockets, which you can even use to lock onto opponents, do massive damage. Of course, ammo is limited for them though. If you do kill an opponent, they'll drop armor, weapon power-ups and fuel for you to collect. That's right, you also have to worry about your fuel here. Don't worry though, as every course has 3 pit stops, one for ammo, one for fuel and one for shields. Sometimes these are close together so you can get all three in one go, but other times they're deliberately spread apart so you've got to choose which ones you need the most for each lap. This is a bit of a mixed bag for me, as sometimes it adds tension to the races, whereas other times you can completely forget which route you need to take on the often confusing tracks to get to which pit stop, though to be fair they are highlighted on the map in the corner. If you do run out of fuel or get destroyed by other racers though, it takes forever for them to put you back on the track, which is really annoying. The game actually has a lot of strange decision choices in it. Firstly is the number of laps per race. There's not a standard lap count. Some tracks have 6 laps, some have 9, some even have as many as 11 laps, which is just crazy. And the laps often still take more than a minute to complete, which means you'll be racing for 10 to 15 minutes on just one race, which may not sound too bad, but they really start to drag. Of course, there are times where this is a good thing, as you might need to pit stop at all 3 stops and you'll still have plenty of time to catch up. But most of the time, I'll be honest, I was bored halfway through the race before I'd even finished. Another thing are the controls. Here you have to hold up on the D-pad to accelerate, and it just never feels right and makes cornering really tough. You're given 3 buttons on the controller which are dedicated to camera views, one for each one available. Surely they could have just had one button to toggle through the views and then put in an acceleration button. The actual steering and over control isn't too bad, but just having to press up to accelerate I never got used to, and I actually found it made my hand cramp up a few times. But once you get used to it, it is playable. That's if you can get past the frame rate. As you may have noticed already from the footage, the game runs pretty slowly, and when there's more than a couple of races on screen, everything slows down to a crawl. So the first lap or so, while everyone is still close together, can be a jerky mess. It doesn't help that everyone is constantly firing their rockets and machine guns too, which makes some annoying sounds all the time. But even when there aren't other races on the screen, you can almost feel the game loading in the track, which doesn't look too bad, but of course it's full of pop-up. Thankfully, they're all quite wide and often give you good warning when corners are coming up. This isn't really a game that I'd recommend to people. The crafts you race in are just not that appealing, it's slow and jerky, and other than some kind of cool music, there's really just nothing all that enjoyable about it. It's odd, as I do actually remember playing the demo for this on the PC way back in the 90s and loving it. Chances are it's just that I didn't know any better back then though. I haven't gone back to try that version, and I have never played the PS1 version, but honestly I can't imagine them being much more enjoyable. Another popular future racing series is WipeOut, and yep, this is the Saturn version. Now, back when these games were first released, a lot of my friends had the PS1 version, and I remember not really enjoying them much back then. But after playing a few games in this series for this video, I have to say I'm now a WipeOut convert. I'm sure you all know the drill here. You've got some awesome looking hovercraft things. Yep, each of them has their own stats, and you complete in a bunch of cups, unlocking more stuff as you go. The graphics here are really good, and I really love the design of the ships and the courses, which all look good too. There is a bit of pop-up here, but it's a lot less noticeable than the other games that we've looked at. You get a decent variety of tracks, and on them you'll see blue boost pads. You'll want to hit as many of these as you can, and you'll also see a bunch of X's on the floor. These give you weapons. This is actually one of my main gripes of the game, is that the weapons are all indicated by a strange icon, and no matter how many times I play, I never know what the hell I've actually got. I can just about recognise the boost icon now, but the rest of them I'll have no idea. I know this is entirely a me problem, but surely a more sensible system would have been better. But it does kind of fit the game, and I'm sure people from the future will know what they mean when they play. My other main gripe with the game is something that annoys me in a lot of futuristic racing games, which is basically that all of the courses are really narrow, and I spend a lot of my time banging into the sides, which can often bring you to a dead stop. Why is it that people seem to think that in the future all racetracks are going to have just about enough room for 2 vehicles at one time? Of course, the more you play, the better you do get, but I have never, and will likely never, in my life, go an entire race without slamming into the sides a ton. However, that didn't stop me from enjoying the game and even winning a lot of races. The game is fast, really smooth, and controls really well. Also, it's got a killer soundtrack that I would easily listen to outside of the game. And in fact, I have loaded up the WipeOut soundtrack on Spotify a few times since playing. I recommend doing that. This is definitely one to add to your collection. I'd like to go back and try the PS1 version just to see how that compares. Of course, WipeOut was a huge success, so we got a sequel, WipeOut 2097. This is again the Saturn version. I know, I'm milking the Saturn, deal with it. This is another fantastic racing game that improves on the first in pretty much every way. Once again, you have some awesome looking crafts to race in, and the detail has been ramped up on just about everything here, and it looks fantastic. The tracks have a similar vibe to them with a lot going on, and again the controls are super smooth and responsive. A few new weapons have been added, notably the autopilot that controls your craft for a few seconds, and the homing missiles. These are welcome additions, and what's even better is that when you get a weapon, a voice actually tells you what weapon you've picked up, so now I don't even need to worry about those stupid icons. I will admit though that there are a few changes that I'm not too keen on. Firstly is the menu system. Rather than just entering a cup and doing a series of races, here you have to select each race and craft from the main menu individually every time you play. So you can't just say do 5 races in a row. After every race you have to go back to the main menu and select your next course and vehicle. There's no podiums or rankings, it just tells you if you've got gold or silver or bronze on each of the respective tracks. You can unlock more stuff as you progress, as well as extra crafts, but it's just all a bit unceremonious. Also, they've added damage to your crafts, so if you're like me and spend most of your time smashing into the sides, here you can actually explode and lose the race. There's pits where you get your energy replenished, but I found that most of the later courses were really tough, as they're all super narrow and I could barely get through some of them. Now, I know that's kind of the point, as they are meant to be challenging, but still. And to make it even tougher, they've now added checkpoints on the tracks, so you've got a pretty strict time limit, though I would say it is kind of fair to get through each stage. After playing through the first game though, these really weren't welcome additions. Of course, neither of these things make the game bad, I just preferred not having to worry about crashing or time limits in the original WipeOut game. However, I did still really enjoy playing this one. The music once again is just awesome and really adds to the game. Both of these games are great with friends too, you really can't go wrong with either title. WipeOut also came to the Nintendo 64 with the predictably titled WipeOut 64, and this just might be my favourite WipeOut game that I've played. Graphically it looks great, with smoother looking ships, and although it has a bit of that N64 blur, the neon colours and lighting are just great here, and there's also a lot less pop-up. As I'm a hypocrite, the game still has a time limit and health bar like in the previous one, but I really didn't notice it as much here, and I think that's down to the awesome controls, thanks to the N64 analog stick. It makes me want to invest in the Saturn analog pad, as I think that would make a big difference playing those games. It really does make a difference here, and the game has more precise cornering. The tracks do seem a little wider here, but they're still pretty narrow, and the game runs at some really high speeds with a fantastic frame rate, so it is still a challenge. All of the weapons from before are here, and I didn't actually see any new real additions, although I'm not totally sure if all the tracks here are new, or if it's sort of a best of from the other games. Some of them did seem familiar, but that could just be because I played 3 WipeOut games in a row. You can choose proper cups here, which I really like, and playing through a series of races with a prize at the end should just be how all racing games work if you ask me. None of this open world rubbish that they're pumping out these days. As you'd expect, the music here is really good, but I have to say that the Saturn music is probably better, but that's likely down to it being a CD format, so they have got higher quality and more variety, but what's here is still very good. And of course you can play this with up to 4 players, which is always a good thing. If you're a fan of racing games, this is definitely one to add to your N64 collection. Sticking with the N64, here is S.C.A.R.S, which is an acronym, but I couldn't figure out what for. This 3D racer sees you take control of vehicles that have their traits from animals. So you have tough but slow rhinos and elephants, small but nimble ants, and lions that are middle of the road, and more. The game looks pretty cool, and I actually really like the vehicle designs, as well as the variety in the tracks. It all runs very smoothly, especially for an Acclaim game, and there's very little pop-up, which is actually quite impressive. The controls here are good, which is really what you should need in a racing game, and it's very noticeably different between the vehicles too. In fact, I tried out all of the ones I managed to unlock, and there was even some that I vowed never to use again, like the Ant, as the handling and speed was just awful. But most of the vehicles are pretty good. It can take some time to get used to the steering though, as it is pretty drifty, if that's even a word, so you have to take corners quite wide. Also, you have a jump button, which does seem odd, but there's loads of weapons to collect and use, and a lot of these create barriers which you can avoid by jumping over them. You also get your usual array of missiles, boosts and shields. Thankfully you can't crash out here though, and you can take as many hits as you like, it just slows you down. You've got a variety of cups to race through, and at the end of them you unlock a challenge which is available in the menu. These challenges are against a single opponent, but if you beat them you'll unlock them as a playable character. I really like the way this is all set up, it's simple and effective. Also, I really like all the tracks. They're quite open here, meaning you, or rather I, don't spend too much time crashing into the walls. The game is definitely not easy, and especially some of the boss challenges which are really tricky, and you'll need an almost perfect run to beat some of them. This is another game that surprised me. It's definitely not the best racing game out there, but it was a lot of fun. It's also released on the Dreamcast, so I'll be sure to check that version out to see how the graphics and gameplay have changed. And yes, you can pick it up on the PS1 as well. Another N64 future racer is Extreme G from Acclaim. This time you're riding future motorbikes around courses that, let's be honest, could have come straight out of the WipeOut series, but that's not a bad thing. The gameplay is similar to most of the games we've looked at here. You choose your vehicle and a cup to race on, then you head off at breakneck speeds around some very narrow racetracks, using weapons you find on the tracks to slow down your opponents and get the advantage. This is probably one of the harder games on the list, and I was terrible at it for the first hour or so of playing, but once you get used to the controls, which by the way are actually pretty good and responsive, they do work well, you'll realise that the races are actually quite fair, though the AI is tough, even on the beginner stages, rarely making mistakes, though it is possible for you to catch up and even win. What makes the game so tricky really though is the speed. This is a damn fast game, even giving F-Zero a run for its money. The courses have plenty of twists and turns and jumps, and you'll need to get familiar with most of the tracks if you want to get first place. Graphically, it's okay, there's enough detail, and I do like the designs of the bikes that you ride. Of course it has that N64 blur, and it does look quite low res, but you know what, if that helps keep a solid frame rate, I'd prefer that to sharper textures. But when you do see the human characters, they look awful. Thankfully, you only see them a handful of times throughout the game. The weapons you get here are fun to use, and this is a blast in multiplayer. Another game that's actually really worth a look if you're after a challenge. Soon after we got XG2, which is more of the same racing action but with a fair few improvements. The game looks noticeably better all round and has some really nice lighting effects, similar to WipeOut 64, though I do have to say I did notice there was a few instances of frame rate drops, which while they weren't major, I don't remember seeing in the first game. There are more tracks this time round, as well as more races and things to unlock. And the tracks here are noticeably wider. I know I keep going on about how wide the tracks are, but it really does make a difference. This makes navigating them a lot more fun if you ask me, which you didn't. The game is still eye-meltingly fast, but the controls are great, so you shouldn't have too much difficulty getting through. The AI also seems to be a bit more forgiving. This doesn't make the game easier necessarily, just a little more fair. New weapons have been added to the mix, and they're all good to use, especially as you now have more defensive options for if you're in first place, with new weapons that attack behind you like a flamethrower or rockets. This is a really nice touch. The music here is also great, as it is in the first game, with the future style techno that most of these games seem to think the future of music is going to be, but it does fit the game really well. My main complaint with Extreme G2, and the other one really, is the camera, which doesn't seem quite right. It's fine for the most part, but I always feel like I can't quite see far enough ahead of me, and not because of the pop-up, just because the camera is more focused on your vehicle than the track. It could just be me though. Overall, both of these games are well worth a look if you're into racing games. Let's go back to the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis if that's how you choose to live your life. Happy now, Toby? For Outrun 2019. This is an interesting take on the Outrun formula set in the distant future, 2019. Now, if you've played an Outrun game before, you already know what to expect. This is almost like a drag race where there are no opponents, you just have to get from point A to point B within the time limit. Every now and then you'll come across a crossroads where you can choose your route, and there's loads of different routes to take across the 4 different cities that you race through. Some routes are easier than others, but the only way to find out is to try them all out. This does give the game some really decent replay value, it's just a shame that the actual gameplay doesn't. Now don't get me wrong, this actually isn't a bad game, it plays almost as well as the regular Outrun games. Your car here looks a lot like the Batmobile, which is always a good thing, and you've got a turbo you can use which makes you go super fast. It's just that the handling isn't great, and there's lots of sections of track that you can just fall off or crash, and it's really hard to get back that time. So if you crash 2 or 3 times in one race, a lot of the time you might as well just restart. Arguably though, you could say the same about the original game, but for some reason it's just a lot more noticeable here. The tracks themselves look pretty cool with bridges, ramps and hills all over the place, but when you're actually racing on them, other than the background graphics, it's hard to tell them apart. Also, one of the main things with the Outrun games is the awesome music, but here the music isn't just forgettable, it's actually pretty crap and really grates on your ears. But you know what, there is some fun to be had with this one. There's just no scenario where I'd recommend it over the original Outrun game. I guess unless someone came to me demanding that they want to play Outrun, but with the Batmobile and shit music. Other than that though, just stick to the original Outrun. And finally for today, and geez if you're still here, thank you. Here is Firebugs for the PlayStation 1. By now, I don't have to tell you that you choose from a selection of races, each with their own stats, and then you choose your cup, compete in a bunch of races to unlock more people and tracks to use, because you already know that. What I do need to tell you though, is that this is a total hidden gem, and I had a blast playing through it. The vehicles here are really cool to use, and each one has its own weapons. Each character has 2 weapons you can use after picking up the icons on the tracks. Each character pretty much has an offensive weapon and a defensive weapon to use. You'll soon find the ones that work best for your playstyle. The controls here are excellent, and while it's not as fast as most of the other games on this list, it is smooth and the tracks lend themselves well to the vehicles. What's cool here is that all the vehicles are able to be flipped upside down but carry on working. This also means that the tracks are full of tunnels and loops that let you drive up the sides, or if you have enough speed, even on the roofs, and if you fall down you aren't penalised and can just carry on. This is great for overtaking other racers or avoiding their attacks. The graphics here are really good with a cool cartoon style that works very well, and everything is bright and colourful with an almost cel-shaded look to it. It's helped everything look really good still, and there's even very little texture warping, which I was kind of surprised by. Of course, as it's the future, everyone listens to techno, and once again you've got a decent soundtrack that actually goes really well with the game. Now, unfortunately, as we've looked at a million games today, there really isn't much else I need to tell you about this one that hasn't always been mentioned in other games, as it does play kind of similarly to most of them. But I will say that this was one of my favourite ones to try out, and I ended up completing every single cut with every character in one sitting. It's really easy to pick up and play, looks great, has a good frame rate, solid controls, and I'll be honest, I hadn't even heard of it until I was browsing games to check out for this video. Definitely play this one if you can. So there you go, a million racing games from the future. What is your favourite futuristic racing game? Let me know in the comments below. I actually really like these kind of games, they're probably some of my favourite racing style games. So we'll definitely be doing a part 2 in the future, where I'll probably look at the GameCube and PS2 era games. So make sure you let me know what I should be checking out. On screen now you can see where you can follow us, so make sure you do so, as we have loads of great content for everyone to enjoy. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.